The year 2020 marks the 70th anniversary of US-Cambodia diplomatic relations. The US ambassador to Cambodia W. Patrick Murphy told VOA Khmer in a recent interview that one of the positive outcomes of this long-term relationship is the significant growth in trade between the two nations in the past 2 decades.
What's growing with the relationship is Cambodian exports to the United States. It's good for the Cambodian market, good for jobs, good for development.
While Cambodia has enjoyed billions of dollars worth of tariff and quota-free exports to the U.S. market since 1997 under the Generalized System of Preferences known as GSP, concerns over human rights and democratic backsliding in recent years in the kingdom have drawn condemnation from some members of the U.S. Congress, who largely dictate which nations get GSP status. In August, the European Union decided to lift 20% of its tax and quota-free preferential treatment for Cambodia under a program known as Everything But Arms, citing concerns about the oppressions of political opponents amongst other human rights violations. In this 30-minute interview with VOA Khmer, Ambassador W. Patrick Murphy discusses a range of topics including human rights and democracy, the investment environment, technology, and education. He also addresses a question raised by many Cambodians. Will Washington follow the European Union, which took punitive actions in response to human rights violations by Cambodia's government, and apply its own pressure on Cambodia by reducing the amount of trade preferences Cambodian exporters receive, or by removing all of its GSP trade benefits?
That's a sovereign decision for the European Commission and the European Union, but we've made very clear, the U.S. government, that we share the fundamental concerns behind that decision. We also have observed shortcomings in Cambodia related to democracy, political rights, and human rights, and have expressed those shared concerns with our European allies.
And the U.S. in the past expressed that it would look into GSP as well if the human rights issue is not getting better. So why hasn't the U.S. acted on that in parallel to the EU decision on the EBA?
I'm not sure what you're referring to in terms of any past statements on the part of the United States, but Cambodia does benefit from trade preferences and access to the U.S. market. That has a set of criteria that to date Cambodia has met. Those criteria are somewhat different than the criteria that the Europeans apply. But what has been stated in Washington from other branches of the U.S. government, our legislative branch, for example, are some concerns, and there has been some draft legislation suggesting that a review is merited of those trade benefits.
In what event that would trigger that, GSP suspension?
Well, that's a real question for Congress. Our Congress plays a very significant role on trade legislation, but separately from that, the criteria are different. Fundamentally, the criteria of U.S. trade preferences under the GSP program look at market access, labor conditions, protection of intellectual property right, for example. And we have ongoing discussions on all of those areas here in Cambodia. At any given time, there's some room for improvement, and our U.S. Trade Representative, which has the lead on this program, and our Department of Labor, with related issues, also focus very closely on those criteria.
As you may know that a lot of through GSP, right? How many billion of dollars right now that Cambodia benefit from the U.S. since the agreement taken place?
Well, you probably know the answer to that question as you're asking it. But Cambodia is a strong beneficiary of trade benefits and access to the U.S. market, and the trade volume has grown quite significantly, including when those trade benefits were expanded to include travel goods. That's a good thing because the program is intended to help economies like Cambodia. But your line of questioning has been about concerns that you raise with the situation here in human rights and democracy. We have a variety of tools in the United States and mechanisms to communicate our concerns. Many of those have been applied, and we've made it very clear here that we do have concerns about some of the shortcomings and the backsliding on democracy and human rights, and that they are important. They are important for the relationship between our two countries. And perhaps even more importantly, they're critical for the people of Cambodia, because good progress on democracy translates to good progress for prosperity and stability and the country's overall development going forward.
We've been talking to human rights people who fighting for human rights activists, and other people who also work in labor industry, like garment industry, in order to promote labor law and the good practice in labor. And they say that actually there's a lot of benefit of GSPs going to some Chinese companies. Are you concerned about that?
Well, what I'm most concerned about is that our trade benefits in Cambodia meet their primary objective, and that is to help the economy here develop and to increase trade, commerce, and investment between our two countries. And in fact, there have been a lot of benefits, very increased employment here and a stronger and growing economy. There are other aspects of our trade and investment relationship that we need to address. Not everything is perfect. Cambodia has pretty good access to the US market. We'd like to make sure American companies can access, in turn, the Cambodian market. And in accessing the market here, find favorable conditions. Strong rule of law, protection of intellectual property, good labor regime, etc.
The Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, is a U.S. trade benefit program designed to help promote economic growth in designated developing countries. It works by providing preferential duty-free entry for some 5,000 products into the U.S. market. Cambodia became a GSP beneficiary in 1997, primarily exporting garment and footwear products to the U.S. In 2016, travel goods such as luggage, handbags, backpacks, and pocket goods were added to GSP, making the U.S. one of the biggest trade partners to Cambodia. In 2019, Cambodian exports to the U.S. reached $5.3 billion, a 40% increase from a year before. As Cambodian exports to the U.S. continue to grow, experts say GSP has become critically important, especially after the European Union withdrew 20% of Cambodia's preferential access to the EU market under the Everything But Arms scheme, also known as EBA.
មានប្រហែលជា80រោងចក្រជាងដែលផលិតកាបូបឬក៏ផលិតផលទិដ្ឋាការទៅអាមេរិកហ្នឹងក៏ប៉ុន្តែក្នុងកំឡុងពេលដែលកម្ពុជាមានបញ្ហាជាមួយអឺរ៉ុបហ្នឹងយើងឃើញថាមានការកើនឡើងមានរោងចក្រខ្លះបិទគ្រាន់តែបដូរពីផលិតកម្មឬក៏ការផលិតពីកៅអៅទៅជាផលិតកាបូបផលិតផលទិដ្ឋាការនោះវិញចឹងហើយបានជាយើងឃើញមានការកើនឡើងហើយបើតែកម្ពុជាមានបញ្ហារឿង EBA មែនក៏ប៉ុន្តែរឿងប្រព័ន្ធ GSP ជាមួយអាមេរិកហ្នឹងគឺអត់ទាន់ទេ
The US accounted for a quarter of Cambodia's exports last year, and its share has risen as a result of the declining exports to the EU. So the EU's decision has boosted US-Cambodia trade to an extent.
GSP and EBA, experts say, remain the two most important backbones of the Cambodian economy and can be powerful tools to pressure the Cambodian government to improve its human rights record.
មិនមែនមានតែខ្ញុំពីវនាឲ្យដកប្រព័ន្ធអនុគ្រោះពន្ធទាំងពីរហ្នឹងណាទាំង EBA ក៏ដោយទាំង GSP ក៏ដោយខ្ញុំនៅតែមើលឃើញថាកម្ពុជាត្រូវការប្រព័ន្ធអនុគ្រោះពន្ធហ្នឹងដើម្បីរក្សានៅភាពប្រកួតប្រជែងរបស់ប្រទេសហើយរក្សានៅសេដ្ឋកិច្ចរបស់ខ្លួនហើយទុកឱកាសឲ្យកម្ពុជាហ្នឹងស្ដារវិស័យផ្សេងៗដូចជាវិស័យកសិកម្មវិស័យកសិឧស្សាហកម្មមីឡាហ្នឹងក៏ប៉ុន្តែទាំងអាមេរិកក៏ដោយទាំង EU ក៏ដោយគួរតែប្រើនៅ ឥទ្ធិពលសេដ្ឋកិច្ចហ្នឹងដើម្បីជំរុញឲ្យកម្ពុជាគោរពនៅធម្មនុញ្ញរបស់ខ្លួនគោរពនៅច្បាប់ទាំងឡាយដែលកម្ពុជាបានសន្យាថាគោរពសិទ្ធិមនុស្សគោរពសិទ្ធិកម្មករក៏ដូចជាគោលការណ៍ប្រជាធិបតេយ្យបាទ
The US has also expressed concerns about human rights in Cambodia, similar to the EU. However, our view, the Economist Intelligence Unit's view, is that in the next 5 years, the US is not going to suspend its generalized system of preferences program for Cambodia, even though it's under review right now. And that's because the US will want to maintain leverage in its relationship with Cambodia with regards to China.
Some observers say that pressure and periodic criticism from Western partners have had the effect of pushing Cambodian government to turn further toward China. Beijing now is by far Cambodia's biggest aid donor and investor and has little interest in promoting an open and vibrant human rights environment in Cambodia. Prime Minister Hun Sen is expected to soon sign a bilateral free trade agreement with Beijing, claiming that it will boost Cambodian exports to China and further strengthen economic cooperation between the two nations. Chinese government right now takes really serious actions trying to expand its business in Cambodia and in other countries, for example, Burma, right? So that its power is kind of spreading out in this region. And so I'm just curious, what is your method in order to make sure that the US too have that kind of voice, you know?
Well, the way you phrase the question, I would say this: China is a big country, a big and growing economy, and a big and growing power. It would be no surprise to any diplomat, including an American diplomat, to find a Chinese economic presence here in Cambodia. We wouldn't ask Cambodia to change that equation. What we do hope for is a level playing field, equal access for all companies, and we think American companies have a lot to offer in a place like Cambodia. This is a growing market. American companies are what I like to call the gold standard. They're backed by US law, which requires them to be vigilant and take measures to combat corruption. They're also very, very keen to be transparent, to have sustainable use of natural resources, to provide quality products and services. But they also look for the fundamentals, strong rule of law, and a good investment climate with lots of transparency, and the opportunity to compete fairly. So I would say that those are our objectives, and sometimes American companies are concerned about some of those aspects here in Cambodia.
Last year, you may know that Mr. Joseph Falter, a Pentagon politician, he sent a letter addressing to the Minister of Defense here about the concern of using the US-funded military base in Ream, you know, as an asset for the US, for the Chinese military. Have you had any update about that?
If I could just correct two aspects of the question. You referred to a former US government official. Generally it's most helpful to talk about the present and current officials who represent the US government. And you described it as a US-funded base. That's not accurate. We have some programs in the past here that were in the military cooperation realm, including a facility that's located at Ream, but we don't fund the base per se. But let me say this on the broader issue. We've seen media reports suggesting that there may be some Chinese military designs on Ream Naval Base. We have expressed our concern about those media reports with officials here in Cambodia. And we've heard from many Cambodian voices inside the country who would be concerned if these reports are accurate, because it would be a violation of the Constitution and raise some questions about regional peace and stability. As the Prime Minister noted a few months ago publicly, he discounted these reports and said that Cambodia has no such plans. Well, that's important we hope the government continues to abide by that position, assuming that's accurate. Because if the reports that cause the concern are accurate, there would be fundamental concerns for the relationship, but more importantly, I think, for the people of Cambodia.
In the worst case scenario, let's say that really happened, that Cambodia allow China to do that. Would that be enough reason to kind of annul the GSP trade preference?
Well, you refer to a hypothetical. As a good diplomat, it's always precarious to address hypotheticals. But let me fundamentally say this. We think it's very important for all countries, Cambodia included, to take every measure possible to protect sovereignty, independent foreign policy. And it's clearly a reality that you see in the Cambodian constitution that would prohibit the basing of any foreign military presence inside the country. For good reason. Cambodia does, and look at Cambodia's history in terms of foreign military presence here and actions here. Cambodia has a lot of reason to take efforts to protect its independence and sovereignty. And to the extent that the Prime Minister has addressed these reports, we think it's a very important position to have, not to allow the basing of foreign troops inside the Kingdom of Cambodia.
Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And in May, the EU has listed Cambodia as one of the country that at high risk of money laundering. Have you heard about that? And are you concerned? And do you see the future actions that the U.S. government might take in terms of money laundering in Cambodia?
You have a lot of questions about the European Union. I hope you're talking to the EU mission here in Cambodia as well. Let me address the United States. We care very much about transparency, about efforts to combat corruption and to avoid money laundering. And this is a global foreign policy priority for the United States. And so the same applies here in Cambodia. We have many discussions here about those aspects for good reason, because money laundering can be very closely associated with other criminal activities, like the trade and transshipment of illicit narcotics, illegal timber, endangered wildlife, and even the trafficking of persons, all things that we work with partners here to try and combat. The Financial Action Task Force here in Asia is an important mechanism, and that deals with money laundering and anti-money laundering efforts. And Cambodia has faced some challenges there. So we encourage Cambodia to adhere to the action plan and the recommendations of FATF in the Asia Pacific, as the entity is known. And we have ongoing conversations for Cambodia to be very, very vigilant, take all measures possible to combat money laundering, because it can be very corrosive, not just for the sake of its illegality, but it can be corrosive for the financial system and, more broadly speaking, for trade and investment.
Before I came here, I talked to a few people who have the background in doing business with other country, and they used to run bank and everything. And they said that the fact that the money laundering is taking place here because Cambodia using US dollars. And
what's the connection? What's the connection between?
It's easy to change the money because the money is already in the US dollar, so they don't have to change, for example, from like other money into Cambodian and then to other money again.
So do you have a question?
So are you concerned about that?
Well, Cambodia is a sovereign country. It makes its own financial decisions in terms of currencies that are allowed or used. I have no particular view on the use of the U.S. dollar here. This is not the only economy that has strong use of the U.S. dollar as a means of transactions. So I don't have a particular comment. I would encourage you to ask the government here about those concerns, though.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. From your point of view, you think that if it's still happening, with the U.S. dollar, would the U.S. government take any kind of measure?
Yeah, I don't know that we would have any concerns about money laundering as associated with a specific currency. Money laundering as a problem, absolutely. How are transactions conducted? What kind of transparency? What kind of oversight? And I have had those conversations here with economic, financial, and banking officials. And we have some partnerships we want to help an economy like Cambodia to be vigilant, to have the right measures in place to ensure that the corrosive kind of money laundering that exists around the region, around the world, even in the United States, there can be money laundering. But we have the tools, we have the institutions, we have the legal means to address it. That's what we want to strengthen here in Cambodia.
I read the statement from the EU and I met a few friends that work in the bank sector, and they said that this money laundering issue kind of scare some big companies, and they might, like some already withdrawing themselves from doing investment in Cambodia. So from a Cambodian point of view, I'm just afraid that other American companies also leaving Cambodia because of that.
Well, I have not heard any examples of companies leaving Cambodia, including for those kind of reasons. However, let me reiterate, in this region, the Asia Pacific is quite fortunate to have the Financial Action Task Force. That's an entity that we work and cooperate with very closely. And that entity has raised some concerns. If I'm not mistaken, Cambodia may have been on the gray list.
Yes.
And that would be very important for Cambodia to be on the right side of the ledger with FATF, because if you're not in a good place there, that does send an unfortunate message to business and to investors. It's critically important for the integrity of Cambodia's banking system, financial institutions, and business to ensure that money laundering does not become a corrosive problem, because it has direct implications for trade and investment. On that, I very much agree. And I will reiterate, we strongly encourage Cambodian stakeholders to take measures to ensure that money laundering is fully combated and eroded and erased in the Kingdom of Cambodia.
Thank you. And I've seen the number of the trades between the U.S. and Cambodia. So far this year it reached 2.7 billion. Is that correct?
I think it's larger than that. But what's growing with the relationship is Cambodian exports to the United States. It's good for the Cambodian market, good for jobs, good for development. We hope, and I hope as ambassador, to also see trade from the United States to Cambodia grow, so we can close the trade imbalance, but also provide Cambodian consumers with the gold standard of choices. And what I like when I travel around Cambodia, I hear from many Cambodians they like American products. It's rightly associated with quality, with getting what you pay for durability, both products and services. And I'd like to expand that. And we are going to do everything we can to increase the trade volume between our two countries. Next month in September, which is coming up in just a few days, we're going to be focusing on trade and investment as part of our 70th anniversary year of the establishment of diplomatic relations. We'll have a virtual trade mission. We'll have many events to focus on American business opportunities here in Cambodia, and opportunity for Cambodians to partner with solid gold American investors and companies.
So what was the trade number in 2019 between Cambodia and the U.S.?
I think it's over 5 billion now. It's grown exponentially in recent decades from a very small level, and it gets bigger each year.
I saw that it was 3.8 in 2018, and then last year is 5.7.
I think that's close to correct. But regardless, I think the fundamental bottom line, 2 points. It's growing. That's good. And 2, we would like to see exports from the United States to Cambodia grow at a faster pace so that we can have a trade balance, but also do good things for both economies. I think to date we're doing a lot of good things for the Cambodian economy, and that continues to be a positive in the relationship. But we want to expand the presence of American business and investment here in the kingdom.
Trade and economic development are improving between Cambodia and the U.S., and that is a key goal for the U.S. But influencing and supporting democratic reforms and institutions building in Cambodia remains a challenge for the U.S. and other Western nations, many involved closely in Cambodia since the early 1990s and the UNTAC period.
ប៉ុន្មានឆ្នាំនេះការស្ថានភាពសិទ្ធិមនុស្សនៅប្រទេសកម្ពុជាយើងមានការប្រឈមខ្លាំងហើយជាពិសេសបន្ទាប់ពីការបោះឆ្នោត2013ហើយហ្នឹងគឺមកដល់អាណត្តិក្រោយនេះគឺយើងមានការពើផ្ទះខ្លាំងណាស់ហើយជារឿងមួយដែលគួរឲ្យសោកស្ដាយដែលប្រទេសកម្ពុជាយើងបានវិវត្តនៅក្នុងន័យថាទោះបីយើងជាប្រទេសកំពុងអភិវឌ្ឍទាំងផ្នែកសេដ្ឋកិច្ចហើយផ្នែកនយោបាយហើយសិទ្ធិមនុស្សហ្នឹងគឺយើងមានការវិវត្តមួយគួរឲ្យកត់សម្គាល់ប៉ុន្តែប្រហែលឆ្នាំចុងក្រោយគឺយើងហាក់ដូចជាដើរថយក្រោយ
10 years ago, we had the Phnom Penh Post and the Cambodia Daily operating. We had opposition political parties functioning. We had a vibrant civil society movement doing its work, trying to protect people. I mean, it was certainly not a great situation for Cambodia in terms of human rights, but there was at least other people who were engaged in the process and demanding rights and demanding justice.
In a 2017 major crackdown, the Cambodian government forced the closure of independent news media, dissolved the opposition political parties, and arrested many rights defenders. Today, opposition voices have been greatly disempowered and subdued.
You have a few remaining outspoken NGOs, but the rest of them are afraid and have gone quiet, in part because they know that there is no limits on Hun Sen's power and that he can make up anything about anybody and send them to prison for as long as he wants.
The latest development in the crackdown against opposition voices in the kingdom was the arrest of prominent union leader Rong Chhun for allegedly inciting social unrest over border demarcation issues with neighboring Vietnam. If convicted, Rong Chhun, president of the Cambodian Confederation of Unions and a long-time government critic, could face 2 years in prison. Recently, you have heard that Mr. Rong Chhun has been arrested, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have the U.S. government done anything done from your side in order to kind of like, have make the government release him from whatever the charges?
Well, in general terms, we think it's very valuable for a country like Cambodia to protect the freedoms that can be found in its constitution, the freedoms of association and speech. And we strongly encourage that those freedoms be strengthened and advanced and protected. We have had something to say. We're concerned about the arrest case, which does suggest some constraints on freedoms of association and speech. And we hope that the government here will be very forthcoming and transparent with any charges that are related to this case. Cambodia has had some success in advancing these kind of fundamental freedoms. We'd like to see them protected and strengthened, not weakened.
Considering the human rights issue in Cambodia, it's still ongoing, right? So what is your method in order to have improved human rights in Cambodia to be better? At least, go back to 10 years ago.
Well, human rights are incredibly important to all of us. And I think we share that in common. If you look at Cambodia's progress and history with human rights challenges, there are many figures here who agree protection of fundamental human rights is really important. I've referenced the Cambodian Constitution. That too makes reference to fundamental rights, and we think that's a good thing. There's been a vibrant, thriving civil society here. There's been a history of multi-party elections and democracy. There's been a lot of progress with other issues like labor unions, freedoms of association and speech. There's no question many of these elements have been under siege and under pressure in the last few years. We've messaged very carefully. We don't think that's a good trend for Cambodia. And we do believe that efforts should be made to strengthen and advance human rights and allow organizations, including civil society, to speak freely, even when critical. That's one message I like to carry here. As a U.S. government representative, I'm often on the receiving end of criticism. That's a reality in a democracy, and I accept it and welcome it because criticism makes us stronger. We also want to ensure that all voices can be heard so that all national citizens in this country can accept the results of political process. If they feel they've had a voice, if they feel they've had an opportunity to contribute, they're much more likely to live and work with the results.
Right now, Cambodia is effectively one state-run country, right? What is your plan to make sure that Cambodian government will allow the other party to join, in the political atmosphere here in Cambodia?
Well, it's also a good question, of course, for Cambodian stakeholders. But from our perspective, we think multi-party democracy is an important element of Cambodia's constitution. And there's been a history of contested elections among many different parties. We very much hope that continues. This is a work in progress. I don't think there has yet been a perfect democratic election in Cambodia, but we've seen elections that have some of the fundamentals, competitive and transparent with high participation rates. That's a positive here in Cambodia. Voters like to turn out.
But from the U.S. standpoint, do you have like a clear plan that try, kind of like making sure that other party can also come and join, that political activity here?
The plan is for Cambodian stakeholders. This is not my country. This is Cambodia's country. What we desire as a partner, however, to see that element of the Constitution protected and strengthened. We have made very clear our concerns with the fact that one of the leading political parties was banned and its leadership prohibited from participating in political life, and some of them charged by what appears to be politically motivated objectives. That's a fundamental concern, and we've made that clear publicly and privately here. What Cambodia needs to think about in preparing for future elections is how to adhere to its constitutional prerogatives and what clearly many Cambodian people would like to see: choices and the freedom to make choices, the freedom to form political parties, be a member of them, and not be subjected to the kind of prohibitions and restrictions and backsliding that have unfortunately occurred here in the last few years. We say that as a partner. The plan, the solution really needs to be one built among all Cambodian stakeholders. That's why we encourage a participatory process and room for all voices.
So you don't have a plan, like for example, if the EU, because of the human rights violation, taking into actions in terms of suspending EBA. So you don't have anything like that, or even a similar mechanism?
Maybe this is a question of language. When I hear plan, that's a solution, that's a blueprint, and that's not our job as a partner. Our partner is to advise and counsel. We have made clear our concerns, and because of those concerns, the bilateral relationship is not meeting its fullest potential. There are areas of cooperation that we have not been able to fulfill because of some of the concerns with human rights and democracy here. So a Cambodia that strengthens its rule of law and democratic principles and respect for human rights will have enormous benefit for the population, for the country's prosperity and stability, but also for its foreign relations, including with the United States. So those concerns and that potential for a better relationship has been quite clearly communicated here. Let's not overlook the fact that there are some good positive ingredients in Cambodia. The country has come a long way from its dark past, but we'd like to see the country get back on track of a more positive trend in all of these areas.
Thank you. Also, Mr. Ambassador, the other question I want to ask is about the Huawei. As you may know, that Cambodian embraced Huawei, network, and it seems that the government is excited about that. You think that would have negative impact on Cambodia or the relationship between Cambodia and the U.S.?
Technology is important for all of us in the 21st century, and we are doing our best to help Cambodia access and use technology to the fullest extent possible. And I've had many conversations in many sectors where technology is helping to improve lives here in Cambodia, even in some surprising sectors like education and public health. And many exchange visitors, we are able to help go to the United States and come back with the most positive impressions about how technology can improve their workplace and their efforts. technology also comes with some risks. And we think it's very important that we protect our national security and our information systems from external threats. And technology can be a channel for threats, particularly from companies that are directed by foreign governments on collecting information or being responsive to the whims and whimsy of those governments. That's a concern. We want to work with private companies who are independent and adhere to rule of law and international standards. Cambodia, as I like to say, is a sovereign country, can choose its partners and its companies, but we advise Cambodia to be eyes wide open about the threats of companies that are directed by their respective governments. That could pose national security risks and erode sovereignty and independence, for example, at the extreme. Huawei is one of those companies. And any country should be very careful about the arrangements they make to protect the integrity of their technology systems.
Technology plays a fundamental role in modern economies, including in Cambodia. According to the Cambodian government and development partners like the UNDP, Cambodia must tap into the potential of new technologies to upgrade and diversify its economy in order to achieve its goal of becoming an upper middle income country by 2030 and high income country by 2050. Yet at this point, industry leaders say Cambodia still lacks the human capital to become a high-tech economy.
We want to have a high-tech industry here. But to have a high-tech industry, you need to have high-tech workers, which means you need to train high-tech workers. But it's hard to tell a student you need to train in this when there's not even one company that they can go work for yet.
The 2020 Investment Climate Report by the U.S. Department of State shows that one of the main challenges American businesses face in Cambodia is a limited supply of skilled labor. Some companies, industry leaders say, have to invest in training the Cambodian workers.
Apparently, Cambodia has some of the best diamond polishers in the world. For Tiffany's, for De Beers, the diamonds, the top diamond companies in the world are using Cambodian talent to polish those diamonds. How is that possible? Well, they've set up very rigorous in-house training programs. But what that shows about the Cambodian worker is that they have the willingness, the drive and ability to learn.
Cambodia has the youngest workforce in Southeast Asia. More than half of the population is youth who are eager to learn. They often are referenced as Cambodia's greatest asset, especially in the context of the high-tech economy of the future and in the context of a fourth industrial revolution or Industry 4.0. But providing these young professionals with access to quality education and pertinent training remains an ongoing challenge. You also said that the U.S. has brought in Cambodian students in order to train them with, so that they have other skills to come back and to kind of like help develop the country. I myself have checked the number of the students that have gone to study in the U.S. The opportunity is great. I myself spent almost 2 years there, so I learned a great deal and I gained some new skill, to kind of come back and help my colleagues to grow together. Mm-hmm. But the number, I think, is still small. Do you have any plan to, in the future, increase the number? As I look at the other countries in the area, their number is way bigger than the number of the students.
Well, I hope, Bopha, that you had a positive experience in the United States. And many Cambodians I talk to, almost universally, have a very positive experience. And I'm so happy to hear that. There are a couple of mechanisms for Cambodians to go to the United States and acquire new skills and new experiences. There are students who independently pursue study in the United States. And in that regard, I would agree. We have about 600 or 700 students each year. I think that is relatively small. I would love, during my time here, to triple, quadruple that number. and I'm expending some energy and effort to see what I can do about that, working with our talented team at my embassy. Many Cambodians would like to study in the United States. We're here to help them navigate, find good, affordable opportunities to do so. We also have a number of programs that we sponsor through the U.S. Embassy, through the U.S. government. Exchanges, programs that are known by very famous names, the Fulbright program, the Humphrey program, other scholar opportunities to do research, to study, to gain new skills. Those numbers are pretty solid for Cambodia. Cambodia is quite competitive with the rest of the region to access those opportunities. And I'm hoping also, of course, we can expand that. But our visitor leadership program, for example, identifies young and upcoming leaders in a whole range of fields to go on short-term trips to the United States. And I get quite jealous of this, travel around to different states. Sometimes they go to states that I've never been to in the big United States. But they come back with new friends, new connections, and new skills. And those programs are outstanding. We also have our Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative, YC. Cambodian young people are very energetic participants. And that number is quite high. And I hope we can continue to grow that so that Cambodians are meeting their counterparts around the region and Americans and improving and strengthening their skills.
Thank you so much for letting us in and giving us time for another great interview, hopefully.
Always nice to be with you, Bopha, and the Voice of America. My pleasure.